As an organization, we were the icebreakers. We opened the trade with China, which had been dormant for a few years through the Civil War and through the anti-Japanese War. We reopened the corridors of trade again at the request of Premier Zhou Enlai and his Chief of Staff, Chi Chao-ching. That was my father and his colleagues. That was difficult times. It took 7 days to fly to Hong Kong. It took 3 days to go from Hong Kong to Beijing. The country in 1953, when my father first went, was desperately poor. So the first thing the country had to do after 49 was to try and rebuild the basics and feed the people and make the people healthy. And of course, the life expectancy soon changed. We were doing business with China all along through that period with our members. We were the primary people doing that business with China. A lot of it from China was basic raw materials, agricultural goods and so on, some minerals and metals, but mainly agricultural goods. And so the trade levels depended upon the weather. If the weather was good and the harvest was good, we did more business. If we did more business on Chinese exports, then there was more opportunity to sell to China because they had the currency with which to do it. So we experienced all of those growing pains of China. I saw them through my father's reports of what he saw. In 1967, there were only 17 visas issued to the UK, and 10 of them were to our company. So we had a greater insight than most. Things began to change after 1978, 1981, reform and opening up, and then in 1987, China took away the monopoly from the foreign trade corporations, and everybody in China started to get involved in foreign trade. We began to focus more and more on understanding China and where China was going, so that we could help the bigger companies plot their way to investments in China. And that was something we spent a lot of time helping foreign companies. I did a lot with the United States. I was one of the first people to do business between the United States and China, and I spent a lot of time in the United States as well as the UK. It's been a journey. We've been on the edge of China's history the whole way from 1953 through to today. My father was a poor man who came from a poor part of London, and he educated himself because he was in hospital a lot at an early age and read a lot of books. And then he was very much affected by the rise of the fascists in London in the 1930s. Because of that, he came in contact with the Communist Party and communism and Marxism, and he read a lot. He had built himself into a small businessman as a textile manufacturer. And that was when, through his interest in world peace, world cooperation, world trade, he went to the Moscow Economic Conference in 1953 in April, where countries from all over the world were meeting to see what they could do to not be impacted by the Cold War, shall we say, that was happening from the United States. He was selected by China to hold this position because he was brave. He was prepared to resist a lot of people who were rude to him. He found that really in the first 10, 15 years, people thought he was a bit strange to go to this place called China. Nobody knew anything about it. But bit by bit, people increasingly wondered why. Why did he do it, and what was he finding there? He was very welcome even to prime ministers. I remember Edward Heath was very interested to hear from him what his view of China was. So he became a man who came from a poor area of London, and people listened to about China. I was the son who trailed along behind. The members of the club were basically companies that wanted to do business in China. And the skill that the 48 Group had was in making contact with the foreign trade corporations, and particularly CCPIT, who were very helpful in those days, in helping us understand whether those companies' businesses were relevant to China's development and whether there would be a market for them. So the 48 Group spent a lot of time helping companies assess whether they should take China seriously at that time, and if they should, to find the roads to do that. I suppose in the early days, there were 19 companies that went in 1953. When I became chairman in 1994, we were about 200, and then we rose to about 600. We merged with the government organization to produce one trade body for developing the trade. Since that time, we've concentrated more on understanding China, because if you're a big company doing business with China and you don't understand China, you only see what's happening in China today. And if you only see what's happening in China today, you get your policy moves wrong. And so we've concentrated on trying to develop a greater understanding of China, and therefore more companies join the trade organization, but we still have a healthy and significant membership, particularly of larger companies who want to understand China. I think in America there's a greater understanding of China. When I went, first of all, in 1972, there was none. They'd been cut off entirely from China. But the Americans like to do things right. They like to know what they're doing, and they work hard at understanding. The Americans business community has taken China a lot more seriously. Partly that's because their big intelligence organization before the Second World War broke up at the end of the Second World War, and all the experts on different parts of the world were put in the top universities to continue their study and understanding. Those basis of knowledge in America about China, like the same as inside China, the universities are a great source of advice and help for policymakers. So I think that the Americans have a deeper understanding, but they have a problem with frustration. And the British get less frustrated, a bit more patient. But the American companies are vast companies. So the British companies, generally speaking, are not so big. Our big area is finance, and China has come to London to take advantage of our financial capability. So I think that, and if we're going to be global Britain, then we have to have a good, intimate relationship with China, even if we have some concerns. We have to manage our concerns. And we also need to be part of what is the center, the East Asia. East Asia is where the future of the world is. The Chinese ceremony was indoors, the British ceremony was outdoors. And watching the ceremony of the transference of Hong Kong to China, back to China, as the rain came down, such a fascinating experience of nature. When you've lived, as I've lived all my life, in a country that has William Shakespeare using the weather to tell the story of the atmosphere, one wondered whether the rain was dousing our spirits or whether it was saying this is goodbye to one era and welcoming a new era with the sun when it comes out later the next day. It was just fascinating seeing the ceremony of the two sides, taking down of one flag, the rising of the other. I could feel the power inside the Chinese people. We've eventually managed to recover our territory of Hong Kong. But the ceremony was moving quite fast, with the moving of the flags and so on. So people were able to handle their emotions and move on. And then the firework display. It was just fascinating to have been there at that moment of history. Well, I think the Greater Bay Area, regardless of Hong Kong, is one of 4 regions in China which are going to shape the future development of the world. I think that these regions that are being developed are much more profound than people realize. That projects like Greater Bay Area, the Yangtze Delta, Chongqing and Chengdu, the area around Beijing, the integration of agriculture and industrial worlds, the creation of all the new features of the digital world, of AI, they're going to create new regions which are beyond anybody's imagination. So I won't be here because I'm a bit too old for that, but for people to look around in 2049 at what is now the Greater Bay Area, they'll say, I never thought this could happen. But remember, we're all the people who said in 1978, China can't modernize. It's got too big a peasant population. It'll never transform. At the moment, it's a bit like the United States. There's a cynicism about China, that China's grown too fast, too powerful, and represents a threat to the Western economics and the Western civilization. That's a very simplistic approach. The world isn't going to divide again. The markets and the economies are growing so fast in different parts of the world. We're all going to have to work out how to work together in the same world. And as that becomes clearer, so some of these cynical views that we can say things that are not so nice about China, or we can cut off our trade links with China or our political links, people will realize it's not viable. The only people who will lose are us. So at the moment, I would say that it's a difficult time. when the ease of being cynical or suspicious of China is easy because people are really concentrating on all the problems we've got internally in the UK and with the European Union, which we've just left. I think what's more important is that the prospects between the UK and China are particularly good, and they're very important because, as China does stress the importance of the United Nations, it's the most important world body that we should all work through and develop through. That we are both members of the Security Council. And if we want to be able to play our roles globally, we're not going to be able to do that with bad relations. I mean, it could get nasty, and I hope it doesn't get nasty. If it does get nasty, it'll take longer to get over it. But China's not going to be pushed back. When I talk to people in Britain, I say to them, you might think that you can deal with China. You can't stop China. But more importantly than whether you can stop China is what do you think China's trying to do? If you think China wants to rule the world, you're wrong. China's done the study and it says, don't try and rule the world because you'll fail and you'll fall. And it's not instinctively within China's history to try and rule the world. China wants to help Asia become the primary continent in the world. And it wants it to work with all the other continents and develop solutions to the world problems. And China's plan is 100, 150 years out. In Europe, most countries don't even think 5 years out. So there's a mismatch between what the leaders are thinking about what to do for inside China and what people elsewhere in the world. We have to try and bring those visions of the short, the medium, and the long term closer together, and an understanding that capitalism is not the enemy of socialism. These are both isms. What we're looking at is what is the way that everybody can benefit from the advances of the GDP, the advances of technology, and how much should people get who lead the way, and how much should be distributed through taxation or dividends to the wider population. I mean, the good thing about anniversaries is you do think about the context and what's happened since the first moment that the anniversary was created of. I think that you have to put it in the context of the relations between the West and the East and between the West and China. And when you put it in that context, that has not been a simple, steady relationship. It's been a changing one, sometimes better, sometimes not so good. But generally speaking, since the mid-1970s, the relationship between China and Asia and the West has been improved, particularly because of a vastly increased amount of trade and some investment of the people-to-people exchanges. And I would say that over the last 50 years, there's been a big increase. We took the first foreign football team to China in 1977 to break the boycott of China in FIFA. And that couldn't have happened if the ambassadorial relations hadn't started. They were able to give a lot of help at quite a high level from the foreign affairs people on both sides. Even at that time, we were doing some ballet exchanges, some acrobat exchanges. But I think that most of all, it's been the opportunity for young people and students to get to know each other's countries, to visit each other. The problems that we've had in the last 3 or 4 years have made that a little bit more difficult. But I think that the understanding of China has increased enormously because of the exchange of ambassadors. And we must get back to that sort of comfortable relationship that we had developed in the last 20, 30 years. The changes that I've seen are beyond anybody's imagination. To see a country that is 85% peasants, that live like peasants, the natural life of a peasant, getting up when the sun comes up and going to bed when the sun goes down. It's just incredible, incredible. Everywhere was a peasant life. Now everywhere is manufacturing and services. The transformation is incredible. I never thought that I would be able to take a car from Beijing to Shanghai, let alone a high-speed train. The transformation of China is just incredible. And one of my jobs now in my work with China is to understand where China's going so as I can explain it to the big companies and help them refine their strategies. They will have less frustration if they have a clearer idea of where China is going. I think of all the things that I just remember the peasant of China. The peasant of China had brought China through 3,000 years of development. Wonderful people. I remember some of the white beards, some of the little babies with pants, the gap in the back, and just wonderful natural life of the Chinese people. But I look today at the students of China that I meet. They are so bright and so capable and so well informed and so hardworking. So I'll leave you with this one story. I organized the first meeting between the Secretary of State for Trade, who was going to China, with Chinese students in the House of Commons, and British students, they both met. And bit by bit, in the course of the conversation, the British students were saying that the Chinese students were not very social. They seemed to work the whole time. British students wanted them to come to parties and relax and get to know the British. And eventually, after about 10 minutes of this, a girl stood up and said, "Excuse me, Secretary of State, I need to tell you and your colleagues something. We are less than 1% of the number of people who want to come here. There are hundreds of thousands who want to come here and study. We're the ones who won the prize to come here and study. We did that by studying harder and longer than anybody else. And when we're here, we'll do the same. We study longer and harder than anybody else in the university to get the benefit of it for our country." And we all sat there with our mouths open. They're two different worlds. And again and again, you find this difference of commitment that comes from China's history and the more laissez-faire approach of the Europeans. But one's not better than the other, it's just different. And the sooner we can live together, the better.